Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing a very significant book called The Yellow Star as we discuss one boy's remarkable journey of survival through the Holocaust. Well, welcome to the programme, and today we have two very distinguished guests. They are Colonel Richard Kemp, who was the commander of the British forces in Afghanistan, and if we're talking about your achievements, Richard, I could spend the whole programme discussing your incredible military career. So
I'd love to. We've got something more important to talk about.
Absolutely. And I'm also joined by my good friend, Zalmi Unsdorfer, who is the chairman of Likud. So, gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Zalmi, it's good to have you back in our studio because the last time we were together was in Israel, and this was part of the Revelation TV's tour of Israel and Jordan, and I had the opportunity to see you on the flight as we flew from Luton to Tel Aviv. And then I asked you if you would be our main speaker when we visited the Israeli Tank Museum in Luton, and you gave an incredibly inspirational talk to our viewers. What does it mean today to be discussing your father's story as Simche, which is just absolutely remarkable, which he wrote in 1961 called The Yellow Star?
I think one has to understand that Israel is a game reserve for the Jews who've been hunted through generations. I don't have to go through the whole list of pogroms and so forth, down to the Holocaust. But Israel is a game reserve. It's the only repository where Jews can live and practice their religion safely, and bring up the children, the generations which were wiped out. We're still not up to the same population as we were before the Second World War. So that's really what it's about, the connection between the Holocaust and the state of Israel, and everything you see in Israel these days is just central. When people finally realize that connection and the strength of it, I think they'll come to better terms with Israel.
Absolutely. And Colonel Richard Kemp, pleasure to have you on the programme today. And I want to thank you personally for the courage and the bravery that you've shown in defending Israel and the Jewish people. You've done it in the United Nations, you've done it in the court of public opinion, you've given countless media interviews defending the nation of Israel, but also those brave and courageous women of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. Why have you taken this upon yourself to fight Israel's war in the media, to tell the truth about Israel and the Jewish people, and where does your love and passion for Israel stem from?
Well, I spent a lot of my childhood and my early military service studying the IDF and admiring the IDF, which is something I think most British officers, British soldiers do, serving and retired. So I gained a lot of understanding of them, and it was towards the end of my military career. I was working in Downing Street for the Prime Minister's office, the Cabinet Office, and my responsibility was intelligence on international terrorism. And this was straight after 9/11. We knew very little about Islamic terrorism. And the people who did, of course, were the Israelis. And I was able to form a very close level of cooperation with Mossad, with the IDF, with other Israeli agencies. And they were extremely helpful to us. They saved, and I won't bore you with the details of it all, but they've saved many, many British citizens' lives, soldiers and civilians, in Afghanistan, Iraq, in the United Kingdom. Through intelligence, through provision of counterterrorism intelligence, as well as military technology, which has made our soldiers safer and more effective on the battlefield, and battlefield medical technology, which has saved the lives of soldiers who have been severely wounded. So, as a former soldier, when I witnessed the horrific propaganda campaign against the State of Israel, after I'd left the army, with my knowledge and my experience, I was in a position to intervene and to publicly comment on it, and that's what I did. And what I've tried to do, as best I can, I think I made a small contribution, is to bring the knowledge of an independent military expert to put into context the situation that Israel faces and the fight they fight, because it's the same fight as we fight over here. It's the same fight as our soldiers fight. We're all on the same side, except they're right at the front line all of the time. And to be honest, in the most basic terms, if I saw our soldiers being abused in the media and accused of war crimes, accused of crimes against humanity, I would stick up for them as well. And I consider soldiers in the IDF, who I know many of them, I've seen them in action, I've seen them close up, I consider them to be the same as our soldiers, so I want to do whatever I can to defend them.
And can you also share with us the impact that the book The Yellow Star, written by Simche Unsdorfer, had on you as a teenager?
I read it when I was about 13, I think it was. I came across a copy of it in my aunt's house. I had nothing else to do, so I picked it up and read it. And it was the first... I knew a little bit about the Second World War by then, quite a bit, actually, but it was my first real insight into the Holocaust. And I have to say, I found it deeply, deeply shocking. Absolutely. It was so incredibly well written in a way that actually brought his experiences in Auschwitz to life. And it was quite terrifying. And I found it also, as well as being very eye-opening and frightening, I found it also extremely inspirational. The heroism that man showed in the face of such horrific evil was beyond description, I think. So yeah, it made a massive impact on me. It's one of the few books I've read in my life. The Bible probably being another one. Well, the Bible definitely being another one. But it's one of the few books I've read in my life which has made the greatest impact on me.
Incredible. And Zalmi, your father wrote this book, Simche. Can you share with his story? He was born into a family in, is it Slovakia?
Bratislava.
Bratislava. Can you just share with us your father's upbringing? His father was a rabbi, a much-loved rabbi in the town, and just share Jewish life prior to the Second World War in Bratislava.
Well, Bratislava was the center of Jewish Talmudic learning. They had a number of institutes there. It was really the cradle of one of the cradles of European Jewish civilization. Like, as you say, my grandfather was a rabbi in that area, a community leader in that area. There were 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and my father was the youngest. And they had a happy childhood. My grandfather was extremely well liked and highly respected, and he used to give speeches every Saturday on the Sabbath. And some of those speeches still survived the burned ashes of the Holocaust, and I read them to my kids on a Friday night. So yes, it was a very, very tender and loving family life until the jackboot of Nazism stepped into Czechoslovakia and with all of their sadism, destroyed it all.
And can you share the very fateful decision made by your grandfather not to take a scholarship to a congregation in New York where he could have saved himself and his family from the horrors of the Holocaust?
He was always very much the community leader and felt that the community was much more important than he. So there was a famous section of the book, or a very impressionable section of the book, where the Nazi commandant, Brunner, needed to fill his quota. He needed 800 Jews in order to qualify for a transport to the death camp from Bratislava. And he couldn't get up to that quota. And this was very common during the Holocaust. You were only allowed, because this is German precision, you were only allowed to be given a train if you had 800 Jews to put on it. And he only had 500, 600 Jews to put on it. And then one day, as the wagons were, they were waiting for their slaughter wagons, Brunner turns up with 200 old people because he emptied out the last old age home in Bratislava. And he brought these people on crutches and on wheelchairs into the camp. And my grandfather saw this absolute total sadism. He says, my father records, this was the most sickening thing of all, to see that they couldn't even give people of 90 and 95 years old the opportunity to die in their beds in their old age home, but had to bring them to make up the quota to go on that transport. And my grandfather spoke to them at the entrance to the barrack when he was pretending not to be a religious rabbi, otherwise he would have been probably put to death. And he gave them a speech at the entrance. And he says, it's all going to be okay. There's no deportations from here. And he swore by his entitlement, his portion in the afterlife, which is the most sacred thing for any Jew. I swear by my inheritance in the afterlife that you will be safe and you will not be. And they asked him, why did you swear for that? You know we're going to be all deported on the train tomorrow. And he says, if it will give these 200 old people 1 day's respite and make the journey easier for them, it's worth my time in the hereafter. That encapsulates for me the brutality and the sadism of people like Brunner.
And Richard, as a student of history, what was it about the Nazis that made Jew hatred the focal point of the Nazi ideology, this desire to annihilate the entire European Jewry off the face of the European continent? If not the world, had they defeated the States and gone on to become the most powerful, dominant power in the world?
Well, of course, anti-Semitism was endemic in Germany for many, many years, possibly many centuries before the Nazis. They simply exploited a feeling that had been there in their country among so many different people. And they, of course, it had become popular after the First World War to blame the Jews for the betrayal. And it was a cause, like, you know, so many other dictators also want. They want to get a cause that people can rally around to support them and support their oppression that they're placing upon the people, and to see another enemy, an enemy within, that the whole of their machinery can focus on. And then, of course, there was their ideology of racial purity, and they saw Jews as impure. They saw them as the Untermensch, and they needed to wipe them out, and it became absolutely their focus. And even to the extent of diverting vital resources from their war effort when they were losing the war. They even maintained their efforts against the Jews then, which shows also the level of insanity among these people.
Absolutely. And Zalmi, we saw that in Bratislava in April 1942, that the fate of the Jewish community changed, and Bratislava was it was part of the Access Power, so they were already start to see the implementation, such as wearing of the yellow star and different rules for Jewish people, the banning of Jews in professions from going to parks, and the beginning of the segregation of Jewish people into ghettos. But then we saw the mass murder of the Jewish people, and in one case, over 3,000 a week. How did your father escape this horror, and how did they flee to the castle in Bratislava?
Well, my grandfather had obtained fake Argentinian passports for the family, and a lot of Jews in Bratislava, the last remaining Jews, had obtained various fake passports, and they convinced the local Slovakian police that they were entitled to be protected. And so they moved into this castle in Mariathal, where they felt reasonably secure because the Nazis hadn't actually entered there and interrogated, who is here and so forth. They just kept on sweeping up Jews from the streets of Bratislava. So basically it was a question of surviving as long as you possibly can. But I think they all knew that eventually the game would be up, and they would come in and examine these passports. And that's exactly what that sadist Brunner did. and showed up one day and started interviewing people. Sprechen Sie Spanish? Do you speak Spanish? And of course they couldn't speak Spanish, so, you know, get in line. And he eventually, with huge degree of sadism, which my father recalls, even as a 19-year-old boy, you know, he saw this man as a dreadful, dreadful creature who did nothing made him happier than to torment Jews. And it was a pretty horrifying experience when they were turfed out of that castle.
And Richard, what would it have been like for Zalmi's father, Simche, to be face-to-face with this Nazi war criminal, SS war criminal, that was responsible for the rounding up of over 100,000 Jews and deporting them to ghettos and also to the death camps?
Well, it must have been terrifying to be face-to-face with him, but also everyone around them, all of the Nazis and the guards around them. And, you know, in the book, in The Yellow Star, he says that it wasn't for people like him who were basically rounded up and imprisoned by the Nazis. It wasn't the glory of fighting soldiers who were able to fight against this evil. That was not for them. They couldn't do it. Now, I disagree with him there. I mean, I hate to say this, but the heroism that he specifically showed, and many others in those camps, was at least as heroic as the fighting spirit of any soldier. Even the slight, just one little thing, when, for example, when he was in Auschwitz, he did something that they told him not to do, which eventually got him out of Auschwitz. But just that one little act of basically defiance would have been enough to have him killed. So that in itself, just that in itself, amounts to the same level of courage as a British soldier shoving a bayonet into somebody, which also is liable to get him killed. And even further than that, if you go on later in the war, you read the book, you'll read about how he lit a Hanukkah candle under the bunk in his accommodation, which had an incredible effect, according to him, on the spirit and morale of those around him. Probably saved people's lives just by injecting a little bit more energy and enthusiasm and life into them. Yet just doing that could have been his death without a shadow of a doubt, and he knew it. So, you know, I think he would have, in facing these people, he would have been extremely fearful, which only goes to show, given that he did defy them in so many different ways, it only goes to show how courageous he was, because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is acting despite fear and overcoming your fear, and I think he shows that time and again.
Absolutely. And Zalmi, your grandfather was a rabbi. He was advised by one of his friends to put off his, to shave his beard, put on a suit, don't look religiously Jewish. What would have happened had the SS discovered that your grandfather was a rabbi?
Well, they would have dragged him out into the streets, as they did to so many rabbis, and cut off his beard in public and told him to scrub the streets on his hands and knees, and to try and humiliate him as much as possible in front of his followers, in order to weaken the enthusiasm that he could still give to the languishing masses in all of their fear and trepidation. So yes, he also had to look like an Argentinian doctor, whatever was in his passport, and they all had to, you know, keep up this pretext.
And Richard, I have to ask you, I mean, around the period of 1944 or so, there were rumours going around the Jewish communities across Europe about what was happening to the Jewish people. Now, the British government and British intelligence must have realised that something was happening, because a few people escaped from Auschwitz-Birkenau to tell the horrific story of what was going on there. How seriously do you think Churchill and the likes of President Roosevelt and the States would have taken this intelligence to know that something absolutely horrific is happening?
I think from my understanding of what happened, I think they both knew. They didn't obviously know the full facts, but I think they recognised a lot about the reality of what was going on, and both wanted to stop it. Many historians have debated and argued about why for example, the camps weren't bombed to shut them down. And of course, that in itself brings great complications when you're talking about we are bombing the Jews and killing them. Yes, it's for the reason of shutting the camps down and saving their lives, but that's what's happening. And people talk about bombing of railway lines, which again is something that is easier said than done. They're not targets that are easy to guarantee you're going to hit. And in particular, when you've got a very, very scarce resource of bombers, which you also need to use for other targets. So I'm not explaining this. I'm not making excuses for why we didn't actually do something more than we did, because perhaps we could have done. But I think you also do have to look at it in the context of a struggle for our very existence, which ultimately succeeded and enabled us, with the Russians as well, the Americans, British, Russians, to eventually liberate these camps and stop the Holocaust from proceeding. So, yeah, maybe there was different ways of going about it en route, but it's very difficult for, I think, the likes of us to second-guess people like Winston Churchill and Roosevelt.
Absolutely. And Zalmi, can you share with us what the ghettos were like in Bratislav, in which all the Jewish people were then rounded up before they were deported to the Nazi death camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau?
Yeah, they were taken out from the castle to a detention camp called Sered, which was just outside where my grandparents were living. That detention camp was just basically a holding camp until they could get 800 Jews, on a transport and to move them out. Conditions there were reasonable. Sabbath could still be observed there, which was very, very important. There is a part of my father's book where he comes. He's given some work to do in the yard, and this brute, Brunner, came along with a claw hammer to threaten Jews who he felt may not be working as hard or whatever. At 19 years old, my father was absolutely terrified that this monster was walking around with guns and this claw hammer. And he had an altercation with him, which literally shook him to the core. And then my father came back to the room where his parents were in the evening. And he'd had a cigarette. And he walked in, and the Sabbath candles were lit on the table. And he felt so terribly bad that he'd forgotten that the Sabbath had come in when, smoking's not allowed on the Sabbath. And how badly he felt. He just survived an altercation with this absolute monster, which had shaken him to his marrow. But he walked into the house where his father and mother were sitting around the Shabbat table with the candles and the loaves and the wine. And that's the thing that really shook him, that he was smoking and he hadn't realized that the Sabbath had come in and stopped working. That really hits you.
Absolutely. And Richard, can you share with us the extent of planning and the administration required to organise the Jewish ghettos, to organise the logistics of transporting Jewish people on horrendous conditions in cattle carriers within the trains, and then the actual building of these Nazi death camps, and why and did this have a detrimental effect on the Nazi war effort? Because surely if they were focusing so much on wanting to kill as many Jews as they could, this is going to take precious resources away from actually winning the war and actually then invading more European countries.
I mean, it was an industry, basically. It was a well-organized. Germans are notorious for their efficiency and organizational skills, and they applied them in huge measure to this operation, to this industry, which is what it was, the mass murder of Jews on a previously unknown scale. And of course, it wasn't just Jews. There was also an industrial operation against the Russians. That was more, I think, more than the kind of extermination camp complex that applied to the Jews. It was more working them to death in labor camps, as they did to the Jews as well. But they had these programs intended to eliminate whole populations from the world. In the Russians' case, it was to create, to reduce the demand for food in areas they'd occupied and to depopulate them by murdering them. And the result for the Jews was similar as well. But yeah, it was a massive amount of energy, a massive skill that went into it, and planning. And it did detract from the war effort. Bizarrely, you know, I mentioned as the war was going the other way for the Germans, they still put a huge amount of energy. They were running desperately short of resources. People at home, many of them were starving, but they still put all these resources into destroying the Jews right up almost to the bitter end. It's in some ways, it's very hard to explain or to understand it.
There is a famous line that says that the Wehrmacht trains to the Eastern Front ran out of gas and fuel long before the trains to Auschwitz. Oof. That's where their priorities lay, and that really was true.
Yeah, quite incredible.
Yes.
Richard, can you explain to us the difference really between the Wehrmacht, which was the regular German army, and that of the SS? Because the SS seemed to be not only obsessed with the occult, but they're the ones that were driving this program of anti-Semitism and wanting to exterminate the Jewish people. And they seem to be the most fanatical of all the Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, the SS under Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, who was essentially the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, were the real hardcore fanatics of the regime, and they effectively held the regime together through a massive network of intelligence throughout the Reich, policing operations. Gestapo was part of the SS, as well as running these concentration camps, extermination camps, and having fighting divisions actually taking part in combat against the Allies in the West and the Russians in the East. So it was a huge organization. The Wehrmacht, on the other hand, was the armed forces of Germany, the Luftwaffe, the Navy and the Army, which obviously they went back a lot further in history and had very honourable traditions in history. And indeed, many Jews who were exterminated during the Second World War fought in the Wehrmacht in the First World War. And in many cases, they fought with great courage and dedication. But I don't think we should look at the Wehrmacht as being something that is entirely clean-handed. It isn't. You'll find many cases, many examples of them not only directly intervening in the kind of war crimes that the SS did and helping them in those war crimes, but also, you know, these were the most powerful forces in Germany. They were more powerful than the SS in pure military terms. Yet what did they do? They did nothing. A handful of them took part in plots against Hitler that sadly didn't succeed in various plots. But I don't think we can see them as being completely free of guilt.
Yeah. And Zalmi, share with us the horrors that your father went through on the night of Tuesday, the 17th of October, 1944, when they were rounded up by the SS and put on the cattle trains all the way to Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Well, he goes into it into great detail and says that even at that time, his father wanted to show leadership, so he made sure that the women were seated to the exterior walls of the cattle truck, and everybody else was inside. And he tried to encourage people and said that, you know, we're not going to Poland, we're going to Austria, or we're going to someplace else until the last minute, to give them the last minutes of hope. There are some incredible stories about what happened during those cattle truck journeys, not least by the Chief Rabbi Lau, whose brother literally carried him into Auschwitz in a mail sack and tried to rescue him under a frozen railway line while the cattle train was in a siding. I mean, all kinds of horrific stories. And I remember going to Yad Vashem and seeing for the first time a real cattle truck, which more recently they brought there with the rails and the cobblestones. It was completely new, and it's the first time I actually had seen that in real terms. And I put my hand onto the wood of this carriage, and I was just completely lost in the story that I was replaying for myself at that moment. And then it's a bit like in an art gallery, you're looking at this painting and you're lost, and then suddenly you take 3 steps backwards and you bump into someone. And I took a step backwards and bumped into somebody, and I turned around to say, I'm really sorry. And it was a young man in an IDF uniform with his M16 slung over his Uzi over his thing. And I realized that I've gone from the Holocaust and this totally defenseless position of my 19-year-old father in a cattle truck and to a totally defensive member of the IDF, part of the strongest army in the Middle East. And if only my father would ever know, or my grandfather would ever know, that this would come to pass, I think it would have brought their faith to ever greater highs. That was an amazing moment for me.
Amazing. Let's have a look now at this extract of this film that would have actually shown what it had been like for those Jewish prisoners arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau and the first expressions of the Nazi death camp.
Tell them you're a seamstress. Understand?
But I'm not.
Tell them you are. Do not join your parents. Your health ain't never sick. Give me.
Next. Your age?
22.
Are you healthy?
Yes, I'm healthy.
And your skills?
I'm a seamstress. I can sew.
Left. Age?
Your German is exquisite, madam.
I attended a classical German high school in Aachen.
Misereatur nostri omnipotens Deo. Careful, don't fall.
Maman! Maman! We'll see you.
And that there just gives us a little bit of an understanding of what it would have been like for those Jewish prisoners arriving for the first time at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Zalmi, I mean, that's a horrific clip, but I think it gives an indication of what it would have been like for those Jewish prisoners actually turning up and arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau for the first time. And you have something quite horrific, but also something very special to show to our viewers now. And this is the yellow star.
This is a real yellow star, which was worn by my father-in-law. He was in Holland at the time, but it's the same, pretty much, that everybody had to wear. It's the genuine article.
And Richard, how would the Germans and the SS controlled the situations at, say, for example, Auschwitz-Birkenau, wanting to install a sense of fear amongst the Jewish prisoners by having the German Shepherd dogs with guns and putting into rows women, children and men, and then really sorting out who would be fit enough for work and who would go straight to the gas chambers to die. How did the Nazis control this situation to bring a sense of overwhelming fear upon their Jewish prisoners?
Well, with unrestrained violence against them. not just threats of violence, but actual violence. And whenever they felt the desire to do so, they'd be happy to kill somebody out of hand to set an example to the rest. And there was there wasn't any kind of law reigning in these camps as far as the way they dealt with the prisoners was concerned. They could do with them what they wanted. They could kill as many as they wanted whenever they wanted. And it wasn't even in the labour camps, the forced labour camps, they weren't interested in preserving labour to make it work. Of course, there was an element of that, but they were very happy to work them to death and, beat them and smash them around and set the dogs on them and shoot them out of hand and crucify them from the gates of the camp and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it was undiluted terror and fear that they imposed.
And one of the most moving... I mean, I read your book a few years ago, and I've gone through it for the sake of this programme. And one of the most moving stories I read about your father's remarkable and inspirational story, but also horrific story of being in Auschwitz-Birkenau was the time that he was separated from his mother and his father, so your grandparents, and his sister and their children, and the fact that your grandfather chose to stay with your grandmother because she was fearful and she was scared, and that was such a demonstration of love when he could have joined your father to actually work, and it probably would have saved his life, but instead he chose to die hand in hand with your grandmother. I mean, what does that tell you about how special and how devoted he was to his wife?
I think it does show that you're dealing with humanity on the one side and bestiality on the other side. I mean, there could not have been a greater contrast between the evil Nazis represented in my grandfather's case by Brunner, or in my father's case by Dr. Mengele, and the goodness of my grandfather and his treatment of his wife to make sure that she wouldn't be agitated and that she would be looked after. Horrendous. I mean, families were separated, children, babies were separated, young mothers were separated from their babies. They were told, give the baby over to the other woman in the line, because if you're carrying that baby, then they will put you to death. You will have babies, you will have an opportunity to have new babies if you survive this. But if you hold on to that baby, you will go into the death. And that is like, it's like Sophie's Choice, that story. These things really, really happen. To my grandparents, no less than to hundreds of thousands of Jews. And just because they were Jewish. And it wasn't just the Nazis, because after the Nazis were pretty much finished, in Hungary, the militias in Hungary took Jews out. Towards the last couple of months of the war, it was over. But they dragged Jews out of their homes at night, took them to the Danube, made them hold hands, and kicked them into the Danube River to their deaths. So it's just an ongoing Jew hatred which exists even to today, which is why we need an Israel.
Absolutely. And, Richard, you served with distinction in the Balkans, which was a very, very difficult war to be a UN peacekeeper in, knowing that the UN forces that you were involved in couldn't actually intervene to stop the Serbs from carrying out acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing. As a soldier and seeing the ethnic cleansing being carried out by the Serbs, what kind of lasting impression does that give you as a soldier?
Well, I've got to correct you slightly there, Simon, because before I went, I saw the fact that British forces were standing by and watching this genocide going ahead, unable to help, unable to do anything, restrained by the United Nations mandate that we're working under. But I most certainly did not do that. I encountered attempts...
Yeah.
Sorry?
I can imagine.
I encountered attempts at ethnic cleansing, both by the Serbs, by the Croats, and also by the Bosnian Serbs, by the Muslims out there, the Bosnian Muslims, rather. And whenever I encountered it, I dealt with it. Now, it was illegal for me to do so. It was illegal for me to stop it, illegal under the UN mandate. But on the other hand, I wasn't going to I couldn't possibly have a conscience and watch people getting ethnically cleansed in those circumstances. It's like walking down the street and watching an old lady getting kicked to pieces under in the side of the road. You'd intervene, legal or illegal, you would, and I did.
That's why you're the man you are today, which is great, and this is why we're doing this programme together. Zalmi, share with us the story about your father, Simche, coming face to face with the notorious Dr. Mengele.
So there were selections on the arrival in Auschwitz. So the parents were immediately put from the entrance. They were put into the death row. And then all of the other inmates were sent into their barracks. And all the barracks had a stove, a pipe running along the center of the barracks, which would heat the barracks. It was kind of a chimney that ran along the barracks and then up into the ceiling. And Dr. Mengele, the Nazi doctor, used to do his selections standing on that flue, because it was higher up on brick. And he would make them go past him, and he would, with his thumb, say, you go there, and you go there, and you go that side, to death, to life, to death, to life. And my father always remembered after the war, I always remember my father saying, after Eichmann was caught, and they were hunting Nazis at the time, he says, however much Joseph Mengele disguises himself, I will always remember him by his thumb. And miraculously, and that's a whole other story, my father was in a line, in a selection line, and he was looking quite sickly at the age of 19. He was very thin and wan, with glasses and so forth, and he was going down the line, and he could see that people in a better condition than him were being sent to the death line. But when it came to his point of coming underneath the thumb, somebody pushed him forward, and the whole line collapsed forward, and they had to... there was a melee, and Mengele shouted that he wanted to do this again, start all over again. And they started all over again. In the meantime, some friends of my father from his barrack changed his appearance, took his glasses off, and gave him a beret and made him go under. And he survived under the second selection. And at the end of that selection, Mengele screamed, "Wo ist der mit die Brillen?" Where is the one with the glasses? And he was furious that he had missed out on one Jew. I later met the person whose father pushed my father in that line, and we had a very nice reunion in our sukkah, or tabernacle, in Jerusalem. Two survivors of such a horrendous experience.
Zalmi, we're down to the last few minutes of the programme. We haven't told all of your father's story, but can you share a little bit about the death march that he went on, and also his liberation by the American forces at Buchenwald?
Yes, I mean, they were first sent to a factory, a working factory, where my father was drilling airplane wings, and then afterwards they were marched to Buchenwald. And by that time, the Allied fire was quite close. And the day of liberation is very well described in the book. A day of great celebration. Obviously, the highlight of the book, really.
Yeah, and we have some other pictures to show you as well. One of Simche. There's Simche being liberated by the Americans.
At Buchenwald.
At Buchenwald, yes. Which is quite incredible.
That's my father in the 50s. And then subsequently, when Eichmann was caught, the Evening Standard interviewed him, because by that time he had written The Yellow Star, and they interviewed him about the Eichmann capture, and the picture you're seeing now was taken by an Evening Standard reporter in my father's office.
And I have to, this is not the end of the story, because there's also a story about how you two came in touch with each other. Can you briefly share the story, Richard, of how you met Zalmi and how you came to write the foreword of this book and have become close friends?
Well, we met on an aeroplane on the way back from Israel to the UK, and we had a chat almost by chance, and Zalmi gave me his card, and I saw the name on it, Unsdorfer. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Well done.
And I said to him, "Are you any relation to S.B. Unsdorfer?" He said, "How do you know my father?" And I explained I didn't know him, of course, but I'd read his book, and he was quite astonished to meet this bloke, this random bloke who'd read his father's book. And I explained to him that it had been one of the greatest inspirations of my life. And when I was facing difficulties as a soldier in some of the different wars I fought in, I always thought about his father and the things he faced, which were always vastly worse than anything I'd faced, and that always gave me great inspiration and courage. And then he contacted me a little bit later and asked me to write a foreword for the book he was planning to republish, which I was honoured to be asked to do that, writing a foreword for a book that I had such admiration for. And I sat on the low wall running through one of the huts in Auschwitz that Zalmi described just now, and wrote the foreword there in Auschwitz itself. And I visited the place where Zalmi's grandparents would have had their ashes dumped by the Nazis, and was able to lay a stone on the commemoration mark there. And it was, for me, it was a great and memorable day, because I met the descendant of who I call S.B. Unsdorfer, the name on the book, Simche Unsdorfer. And it's been such a pleasure and a privilege to know you, Zalmi, ever since then, and I honour you and I honour your father.
Absolutely, and that's what we want to do on this programme. So, in the closing programme, how much does it mean to you that this great war hero in Richard Kemp has written the foreword of your father's book? Not only done that, but actually inspired him to stand up for Israel and the Jewish people. And the fact that we're doing a programme today on your father shows what an incredible legacy that he's left behind.
Well, honestly, listening to Richard talking about how he would come across acts of genocide and stand in the way of acts of genocide in a completely different theatre of war in the Balkans, I think my father would be humbled by the idea that he had inspired someone who would stand up to the tyranny against others. I think that would be the most tremendous satisfaction for him, and hopefully in the afterlife that we all look to, we will all be able to reflect on that.
And tell me, within 20 seconds, how can our viewers get hold of your father's incredible book called The Yellow Star?
You can go on to Amazon, and you can put in The Yellow Star and you put Kemp in, you'll get there.
Excellent. I thank you. I just want to thank you very much for being part of this very special programme, and it's fantastic that we can honour your father Simche as well as your grandfather and your family, and thank you for what you both do in standing up for Israel and the Jewish people. And I think this is an incredible testimony of how one man's horrific experience has inspired people like Richard to do what he's done and the military career that he's had.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. There is no doubt that today has been a very, very special programme, as we've remembered the life of Simche Unsdorfer, the father of Zalmi. So it's important that as we reflect on the horrors of what happened during the Holocaust and the dangers where Jew hatred can take Western civilization, it's important to acknowledge that there is a Jewish state that is the home to the Jewish people. And that's why we got to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. So I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.
El Malei Rachamim, the traditional Jewish prayer for our departed ancestors, will be sung by Lieutenant Colonel Shai Abramson, the chief cantor of the IDF, together with the IDF Rabbinical Choir, conducted by Ophir Sobol. Please rise.
El Malei Rachamim. שוכן במרומים, דיין אלמנות, ואבי יתומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה. במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מאירים ומזהירים. לנשמות 6,000,000 אחינו ואחיותינו, רבבות אלפי ישראל, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו, שנחנקו, שנקברו חיים ושומטו בכל מיני מיתות משונות ואכזריות בידי הגרמנים הנאצים ויוזריהם, ושהלכו לעולמם על קידוש השם. קידוש השם. שאנו מתפללים לעילוי נשמותיהם, לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, וייצרו בצרור החיים את נשמותיהם. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם עד עיני ונחלתם, וינוחו ושלום על משכבותם ונאמר אמן.
Okay, what God thinks. I wish to know myself. God, what do you think?
30-second answer.
I hope he smiles.
Yeah, I don't know God's heart for the politics, but I know that he wants our nation to come back to him. And whether he brings us into a good place, an easy place, for an easy ride, then maybe that's just his grace. Or if he brings us into a harder place so that people would seek his face. I don't know, but I know one thing. I don't know politics, but I know that God wants the salvation of Israel.
Well, I think in a big way, God doesn't care about politics. Politics should care about God and what he is saying. And there are scriptures in the Psalms, for example, why a nation rises against his people and against Israel and making plots and different plans. And then it says, God will laugh. So that's what God is doing many times. He just laughs. When we see people make foolish decisions, he just smiles because he is going to do his will if we agree or not, if our politics and politicians agree or not.
God have promises over Israel, and he's going to fulfill it if we want it or not. But I think it's important for us as believers, for the Jews and the Arabs, that we'll not let the politics of this world enter our message.
My place is to pray and to understand what's God's plan. It's not easy, but my part is just to pray.
To love your neighbor is to love your neighbor, you know. It's the Arabs, it's the Arabs, it's the Ali, it's the Muslims, it's the Jewish, to love them. Because a lot of times politics is not God's heart, especially when there is a lot of interest. Then I believe that God is seeking people who their plan and their hope is to speak about love.
I think at times he must nearly despair because with the politics and the level of competition here and the level of compromise, I think it must be at the very least exasperating for him to see such animosity and hostility between parties.
I believe God really wants every government to be a God-fearing government, regardless of the nation, regardless of the location. Yet God knows that we as people, as a nation here in Israel and anywhere else in the world, we have a sinful nature, and that nature is the one rejecting God and his word and his moral. So God is working with who is willing to work with him, and he's using, you can see it throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, he's using political systems, corrupt, violent, to bring about his will. I'm not saying that the land of Israel or the governments of Israel are violent. I'm just saying that God is using people who are not necessarily individual followers of him to bring about his will and purposes. And the purpose is people coming to know the God of Israel in a personal, loving way.
I think it's really important that we will see up, not right and not left, but we trust in God, and wherever he brings, it will be a blessing for us.
The Bible said the hearts of the kings is in his hands. He moves it toward where he wants, and God knows what he's doing.
God is the one that is in control of everything, so we've just put all the politics in his hand. And what we've been crying out for, especially in our congregation, is that God would put the right person to lead Israel in these times.
I think God is confused in one way about how he created a people group, peoples who could get things so mixed up and so wrong. But God is also patient, and God will accomplish what he plans, no matter how stubborn and strong we are in the things that we want to do.
I will encourage everyone to take 5 minutes of your day, or maybe 1 minute, just to pray for the leaders of both governments, Israel and the Palestinian Authority, because that's what will bring reconciliation. And finding peace without the Prince of Peace, that's a big lie. We need the Prince of Peace.